and to get rid of them. So every day for almost 2 weeks when I came home from work, I would use a fly swatter and start killing them. And I would end up with a pile of dead flies on the floor. And I had to use a dustpan and a broom to sweep them up. But, you know, just to go back a little bit, every living creature has a spirit. They all do, including flies. And, you know, after I killed those flies, my wife and I would be watching our big screen TV, you know, and we had out in the living room type thing. And there would be a fly up every once in a while. We could see it in the light of the screen of the TV. And I would get the fly swatter for another one that would fly up. And we realized they were dead. I mean, they were ghost flies. They were flying around in spirit form. I thought that was really weird. There was no fly to hit. It was gone. It was, you know, I could say, well, I was seeing things, but both my wife and I saw them. And so I know that happened for sure.
Well, you know, did you ever check in the house? I mean, were you renting or did you own it? I mean, did you ever check to see if somebody died in the house or was murdered or buried somewhere? The reason why I'm going to say this, Alan, my grandmother, Emma, when I was a little kid, they rented a house up in White Center, and that's in Washington State. They rented this little house, you know, one-bedroom house, and they lived in it for about a year or so, but they were having paranormal experiences. But back then, they didn't call it paranormal. They just, you know, would tell my mom and my dad, and I was a young kid at the time, you know, that strange things were going on in the house. You know, things were moving. They would hear, you know, screams at night and all that stuff. And this went on for like about a year. And finally, they couldn't take it anymore. They moved out. And then I guess the next person, the guy ended up selling the house, or I don't know what the story is behind it. But all of a sudden, the prior owner of the house was made all the newspapers, was arrested. What he did is he killed his wife and buried her underneath, you know, the on the ground underneath, you know, the planks of the house, under the floorboards, you know, into the dirt. And, you know, wrapped her up in a blanket and chained it and all that stuff and stuck her, you know, in the ground. And as soon as, you know, that came out, you know, my grandfather and my grandmother and even my parents were convinced it had to be, you know, her spirit because, I mean, you know, a lot of strange things went on there. I mean, you know, I was a little kid, so I didn't really pay attention to it. But I remember my mom, you know, saying that she would be there and things would move or, you know, you hear the creaking at night or a lady screaming and stuff like that. It was, you know, I'm just wondering. You know, like in your case, like with those flies, maybe somebody, you know, could have been, you know, buried there somewhere or something, you know, not just recently, but I mean, you know, a long time ago.
Well, when we got married, or we moved back to my old neighborhood, and that house I remember from when I was a kid, go down the street and pass it, you know. And I know there was an elderly lady that lived there, and I'm pretty sure she died in the house. But I don't believe she was buried out on the property anywhere. The house, like I said, was about 70 years old. But we did not have a history of the house when we moved in. We bought it. It was a bank repo. And whoever had it before us went through the house and remodeled it and everything else. And that could have caused some of the paranormal also. But so we moved in without even knowing what we were getting into. And as we were talking to the neighbors and stuff who had been in the area for a while, they said that that house, when it was empty, after the people moved out, before we moved in, and it sat empty for a long time. But anyway, they were doing drugs in it. I guess there were street people all over there, and they would go onto the property and do drugs that, like in the carport. So anyway, we also found a pentagram underneath part of the floor in there. And so I think they were doing things that they shouldn't have been doing. And they might have even opened a portal,
That's possible. Very possible.
And allowed these things to come in. You might ask, well, why did you stay there for 3 years before you moved? The only thing is when we first moved in, it was okay. We didn't see those things, and we didn't have that problem. We were there for almost a good year before we started out with the shadow people, And then I believe the flies came. No, excuse me, it wasn't the flies. The next thing, it's a chapter in my book, Roads Less Traveled. There was this thing that would run up to my ear at night when I was sleeping, and it would scream, a screech right in my ear as loud as it could, and it would wake me up out of a sound sleep. And sometimes it would do it 2 or 3 times a night. And I had to get up early to go to work in the morning, about 5 o'clock. I wasn't getting very much sleep. But we call the chapter in the book, by the way, is called The Banshee on Dunlap Avenue. And that's what I called it. It was a banshee because it was female. She looked like a scrawny witch. I mean, she had scrawny legs, scrawny arms, long fingers with long fingernails. She had a really scrawny face, even with a long pointed nose. And she would run up to me at night and just yell in my ear. And
sounds like she didn't like you.
At first I thought, well, apparently. I kind of had a feeling they didn't want anybody in the house. That's what I got.
Well, but you don't know what, even on that house, I don't know how old it was that when you moved in, but you don't know what was there before that house was built, I know, up where I lived, our next door neighbor when I was a little kid, up in Seattle, where my parents bought their house back in the early 50s. And I mean, I grew up till I was like 24 there. And it was like a little mini farm next to our house before, they took it down, and built a house there. But it was a shack, and it was a guy and his wife lived in it. And for some reason, I don't know what happened. They lost their property, and the guy hung himself in the shack. And
oh my goodness,
and the people at the Purdy's, that's their last names, that bought the house, the property, and built, had a nice modern house built back then. That would have been in probably the early 60s. That part was done. Yeah. But they claimed, that they saw, the guy hanging, in their house a couple of times, So I don't know. Really? So you don't know what could have happened in that property before they even built the house.
Yeah, my advice is for anybody that buys a older home, they might want to find out what the history is of that house before they buy it, because they could really get themselves in a lot of trouble. Just like our house, fortunately, we deal with spirits and stuff, and we had a friend come over, and we blessed the house. We saged it, and we blessed it. And when we were done, the only thing that we had left were the shadow people. For some reason, we couldn't get rid of the shadow people, but we did get rid of the banshee. We got rid of that evil entity and the flies, and so we got rid of a lot of the things that was in that house. but we went ahead and moved out. We moved up here from there to Utah, so we live up here now. Nicer climate and everything. Yeah, but when you move into a house, be very careful. Try to find out as much history as you can about it before you do, unless you like ghosts and stuff like that.
Well, I don't know, but you talk about. I talked to like one person that wrote a book. It's called Gettysburg, and he didn't believe in ghosts at all. Till he bought his house, and it was turn of Civil War era house. And he was remodeling it, and it was little strange things, like it was just him and his brother there, remodeling the house, during the day, and they would put their tools in one spot in the room, lock up the house, go home. The next day they come back and work on it. The tools were moved, in a different spot of the room. But then he even said it got so bad at one point the tools, like the skill saw or circular saw, all of a sudden was in the next room. And he said, no, it was, I left it right there by the ladder. And then it was in the next room, the next morning. And it was like they were being tormented. And then it got so bad that him and his son would hear, soldiers' voices and stuff like that. So, the thing is, if you buy an old property too, don't forget, there's no records of it was quite common if you had an old house that was built like in the 1860s, 1870s, depending on what part of the country. When somebody died, they could be right out there under that apple tree or maple tree, buried. And, again, too, it could be maybe an Indian burial ground, or a lot of times, from the Civil War. So they just buried people, soldiers, wherever they could bury them. So they, like 100 years later, they built a house over it,
Yeah, really. Well, especially us who live in the West, Indian burial grounds are kind of common, I believe, out here, And, of course, the developer's not going to tell you, oh, by the way, your house sits in the middle of an Indian burial ground, So, yeah.
Well, it'd make it hard to sell
careful.
it. Well, you know what?
Exactly.
I think most states, though, in this country, if somebody's been killed in a house or something bad has really happened in the house, they have to tell you that when you buy the house. I mean, otherwise you can sue them. Years ago, I mean, they could have been a mass murder in the house, right? Where eight or nine family members were hacked to death. They didn't have to tell you that. Yeah. So you bought the house, and then, hopefully they didn't have all these, spirits running around.
Really. The apartment that we live in right now, we don't really call it haunted, but we do have a couple spirits in here. But they're kind of benign, They don't do anything mean. They play with our light switches mainly. We'll turn on the front porch and back porch lights, when it gets nighttime. But they'll come along and either turn one off or, just playing with us. They started recently, too, to play with the kitchen light. My wife was sitting on the bed one night, and she can see the kitchen from where she sits on the bed. And she said, I don't want to say anything, but the kitchen light just came on. And sure enough, went out there and the light switch was on. So they're more playful than anything, so we don't worry about them being here. We believe it's the spirit of the owner or the renter of the house before we came. He basically committed suicide. He went out in the desert and just died out there in the desert. I think it was on purpose, though. But he found his way back to the apartment, and I'm pretty sure that's who's in there. A lot of the things that he does, it's almost like he's telling us that we don't belong here or something. Like turning off the lights, like we're using too much electricity or something.
Well, at least he's not opening the refrigerator in the middle of the night.
Yeah, really, for sure. But, yeah, we just